Good afternoon, and hope you are enjoying the 2021 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Jack Blasberg, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, Select Your Fighter, How to Assess Players and Build an Esports Roster. Our panelists today are Greg Kim, Director of Esports at Evil Geniuses, Tal Shachar, former Chief Digital Officer at Immortals, Doug Watson, Head of Esports Insights at Riot Games, and Emily Rand, Analyst at the League Championship Series. Our panel will be moderated by Ryan Friedman, former Chief of Staff at Dignitas. The panel will run for 35 minutes, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please use the chat on the right side of the window for discussions during the panel, and the Q&A option also on the right to submit questions to our panelists. You can also share questions on Twitter using the hashtag #ForFunRegion. Questions will be then selected by the moderator. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks. Yeah, I love the hashtag #ForFunRegion, by the way. That's definitely going to be the highlight of this panel.
Yikes.
Cool. So I'm super stoked to be on this panel with y'all. I think this is going to be super interesting, and there's a lot to talk about regarding, roster building and data analytics place within that in esports. As Chief of Staff at Dignitas, and before that at the Houston Rockets' own Clutch Gaming, we tried to implement a lot of data analytics into our roster building processes, but just due to the kind of nascent industry and the fact that there wasn't a lot of precedent for data analytics in esports, we didn't have a ton of success, frankly. But y'all have been doing it, more comprehensively and to a more recent date than I ever did. So curious kind of about y'all's thoughts at a high level on data analytics' place in roster building, scouting, et cetera, in esports today. Doug, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Ryan, and thanks to the folks here at Sloan for making this great conference come together. It's great to be back here. Esports is a really incredibly young industry, and it's one where there's a lot of opportunities for infrastructure development, including analytics. And I think we're starting to see analytics from a roster development perspective start to gain traction and to really become a gravitational pull for a number of teams and organizations around the sport. But from the league and publisher side, our view is that we can keep progressing that faster. We want to develop more talent, develop more pros to get better tools here. So our aspiration is to ensure that the data that is behind the game gets out and that we can encourage use of it across the teams and the broader community to make this a reality and apply analytics at a faster pace than we've seen in even traditional sports. So.
Yeah, it makes sense. Greg, I know you as well have done kind of a lot of work with trying to build up your internal analytics department, and I'm sure a lot of the stuff that Doug's been doing has been very helpful with that. How about you? How do you feel about analytics?
Yeah, it definitely dovetails with what Doug said, and the team to game publisher relationship is a really important one in this because the data availability depends on what Riot can pull from the games to get to us to help make those decisions. But I think in terms of how we leverage data analytics and player scouting and roster building, it's certainly a tool that we use, but it's early days. I think we're in a state where we're leveling up the type of data that we can ingest and how we process that data, how we frame it, and how we build insights off of it. But I would say it's just one of the many tools that we use. I think alongside the data, video review is a huge element of what we do, just seeing how the players play in matches on the Rifts. And the other element of this just being a team sport, and particularly in the recent League of Legends metas, how a team works together and how you think a team culture is going to develop, and player motivation is a huge asset, a huge variable. So I think it's one of the tools. It's one that we're learning more about. It's one that we hope to incorporate more, but for now, it's just one of the tools that's somewhat informative alongside of many other evaluation elements that we bake into player scouting.
It's definitely improved over the past several years, right?
I'd say so.
Upward.
Yeah, and one of the things that we got our hands on more recently, for example, is per second data, right? That stuff's amazing. You can start to build more positional perception and build more advanced type of stats and ways to evaluate players off of it rather than just some of the counting stats and the basic level things. It's kind of like, I guess, like adding all the positional data to NBA and all like I guess, was it the second spectrum cams to like the league? It's kind of like that level of addition for us. And, I think we're happy to have our hands on it, and we're constantly thinking about how to integrate it better.
Yeah, makes total sense. Emily, I know you have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge in trying to use data and apply it to players is having it provide context without being like, okay, these counting statistics to Greg's point, because a lot of the data we have right now is still just counting statistics like, kills to death ratio, like creep score per minute, that kind of thing. And trying to apply it to looking at the player from a more holistic perspective, combining it with video data and stuff like that. I know when I first started doing any sort of data and like statistical breakdowns, I like came in and I was like, yeah, I'm going to create a war statistic for players and it's going to be great. And even breaking it down like just to one position. So like I chose AD carry because I thought that would be the easiest thing to do because it's the most straightforward position, I think, in League of Legends. There are still so many variables and things change from meta to meta so drastically, even with one patch, never mind from year to year, that I think data is really important for scouting, but it also, you need the video part and you need to understand it in a more holistic context.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely correct. I mean, one of the things that I often joke is that like the second S in esports is actually a pretty critical one because esports are plural because they're not monolithic. Different esports are very different structurally, and how easy it is, I think, to sort of utilize data is different, honestly, across the sport. The same way that you would think that baseball stats are different than NBA stats, and it's easier perhaps to do analysis with baseball than soccer. That's definitely true across different esports. And part of it that I also think about is I think we've been getting a lot better on the R&D side, if you will, of analytics and creating better data packages, getting our hands on more data. I think we're still very much in the early days on the like implementation and sort of almost like commercialization, if you will, of data as it applies to roster building. And so, Ryan, you sort of talked about like trying to be, push the boundaries in the early days. I think we've built on that, but quite frankly, I think like overall as an industry, we still have a long way to go to even take advantage of what we already have today. Like, I think, candidly, like most teams are not yet as sophisticated at utilizing and coaches even also at utilizing data the way that we probably will be in a couple of years. As well.
You think that's a lack of manpower? Like, do you think if teams hired full-time data analyst staff that we could solve for some of that?
I think, look, I think there's, of course, like part of it is just like the history of sort of sports suggests that over time, you get more and more data and analytics focused folks into positions and roles, particularly more senior in an organization, and it kind of fuses with sort of the more traditional, for lack of a better word, talent evaluation methodologies, and you make a lot of headway there. So, we're sort of probably in the early days of that. So I think there's a talent piece to it. I also just think, quite frankly, that it's just we're so nascent and early that there's so many variables, as Greg mentioned, that go into building a great roster that like it's just we're getting better across almost all of those variables of talent evaluation. It still have a long way to go. So it just shouldn't be a shock or a surprise that we're still nascent when it comes to data. I know some folks sometimes think, oh, your games, there's so much data, you guys should be way ahead. But if you think about the like history and arc of building teams, we're still so new at this in this space that it sort of makes sense that it wouldn't be as robust as it might be in more traditional sports. At least that's my perspective.
And I think even if we look back at traditional sports, right, you have different teams that have different approaches that create different focuses of where they want to create that competitive advantage, be it from like how they scout, how do they develop talent, how do they acquire talent that's already existing, and where do they put that emphasis? So I think from an esports perspective, we're still going to see that level of granularity also play out, where teams use their analytical capabilities differently. And over time, my expectation is that we'll see some of these best practices, especially as people go from organization to organization and kind of spread the word. They'll become baseline. but you'll still have teams that have a different type of focus on different elements of it in order to make sure that they can stay one step ahead and win championships.
Yeah, I mean that I think that makes a ton of sense. And look, Doug, I know you guys have, like Tal was saying, just an enormous amount of data, and are probably ahead of most of the teams in terms of incorporating and really understanding that data. Would love to hear a little bit about what you're doing with the amateur scene to encourage player growth, and try to foster, a healthy North American pipeline for players. And would love some of the data behind those decisions if you can share it.
Yeah, that's a great topic. So at Riot, when we decide to invest into an esport like League of Legends or with Valorant, our focus is on making it a multi-generational sport, which means that we need to have both stars of today as well as a really healthy pipeline of stars of tomorrow that can continue to fuel the sport. And so that really requires a concerted effort across the company, be it from making the game exciting and building ways for younger generations to get into the game, but also ways for that talent to develop and to get to the professional level and reach that apex. So for us, when we think about the amateur scene, our view is how do we make sure that we can have talent coming up that has the access of a path to pro that's easily there and that they can see and can reach out and touch. And that really varies from region to region for us, especially as we start thinking about cultural differences, legal differences, and other operational components. A great example of this, though, is I think our European development. In Europe, a couple of years ago, we noticed that there was a gap in the talent that was coming up, primarily driven by the fact that if you wanted to compete at the highest level, you had to uproot yourself and move to Germany. And for a lot of 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, that was not reasonable to leave their home country, to leave and go somewhere else with a different language and to live in a different environment. And so our focus at that point was to say, okay, how can we unblock that? And what we focus on is creating regional leagues that allow those kids to start developing at a younger age locally, but to have a type of professional competitive experience that they could build up and then build into a higher level league with our European Masters. And then to have that talent develop up into the LEC, which is now, again, gaining a lot of international momentum due to that type of talent development. And so from a Riot perspective, our view is, okay, how can we make sure that we create that type of a framework and develop it across the regions that, again, matches the needs of the region and allows the type of talent to flourish.
Yeah. So in North America, that's more so the focus on like the scouting grounds, the proving grounds now, right?
Yeah, exactly. In North America, we have different needs, and there's other types of challenges that we're facing and looking to run down in North America as well, be it to how we develop talent and how do you make it so that, again, a region that's as large as it is able to have talent play consistently and, again, face those similar types of needs. And so it's a continual evolution, similar to as it is in Korea and China for us as we take different approaches from league to league.
Yeah. Well, Greg, I know you've worked in a bunch of different leagues and a bunch of different regions across a bunch of different games, right? And so, like, curious about your thoughts on the differences between building development pipelines across various regions, the use of data analytics, if any, in those games.
Yeah, I mean, I think it dovetails exactly with what Doug was saying, because we're an LCS team, right? And we're one of 10 teams in North America. North America as a region has its place in the broader League of Legends ecosystem. And to Doug's point, like, if we want the league to be successful, if we want to be successful as a team within that league, and just sort of given the current state of salaries and rosters and all the familiar faces we've seen in the LCS, like, one of the big pillars of our League of Legends operation this year is that development pipeline. And with all that Riot did this year in shifting the academy system to incorporating amateur play and proving grounds, like, I'm very proud to have had a staff and organization that's responded to that by extending our operation into that amateur system. Because, from the team side of it, it's just as important to us, right? Like, we want to have the future stars of North America for the sake of the product. And as evil geniuses, we want those future stars to be within our program, right? And, like, I'm proud to have, I think, be the only LCS org that has had both our academy and amateur team qualify for the elimination stages of the Proving Grounds tournament. I think it took a lot of work and brilliance from my coaching staff and my scouting staff and my developmental staff here at EG to identify those players, to some extent leveraging data, to some extent watching a ton of VODs and getting a sense for these players. And also once we had them in our doorstep, like teaching them all these concepts, right? Because I think a big part of this is like when you play esports at a competitive level, it's very different from playing like at home, like in solo queue or with your friends, right? There are many different team concepts, and this applies not just to League, but to Valorant and other titles, where you need to learn how to play as a team. You need to learn how to play as a competitive environment, and you also need to learn how to be a professional and like tweet responsibly and conduct yourself well. And I think the earlier we can bring someone into our system and teach them all those things, the better they're going to be when they get the professional level, the better the ecosystem is as a whole. And I'm proud to be an org that's contributing back to that and seeing some competitive success along the way. I think we're very excited with our developmental prospects and bringing them into the fold as the years go by.
Yeah, y'all have done phenomenally. I like the mention of tweeting responsibly, by the way. I think the best Twitter thread or group or whatever it's called is Shaka Rez's gamer tweets.
Oh, those
where
are
he
my
just,
favorite.
Yeah, he just lists all of the different like just absurd tweets that esports players have put up over the years. Worth looking at if you haven't. Emily, I know you as well have thoughts on kind of the differences in needs between regions in League of Legends for like different solutions for player development. You've worked a ton in the LPL, and we've talked a little bit about the major differences between the LPL and the LCS. So curious your thoughts on kind of what those are and what the LCS needs in your perspective.
Yeah, so looking at LPL, I think there are a lot of lessons you can take from LPL, and then there are a lot of lessons that you have to understand that the LPL is massive. It's the largest player base. They have over 30 servers in China. And the reason why it became so popular is because it was in a Tencent client called QQ, where basically if you're a kid, you don't have to go bug your parents to use their ID number to play a game, right? Like you can just say you're doing your homework and then actually you're playing League of Legends. So it was really well advertised. It was really easy for young kids to be able to start playing at like really, really young ages. So even in the early days where I think people didn't know how to scout players, they pretty much were just looking at solo rank, which is good to some extent, but doesn't tell you what type of player it'll be. It doesn't tell you how they'll do across like different metas, or even necessarily what their champion pool is. They might have multiple accounts, stuff like that. Like even just pulling someone off of solo queue requires a lot more context, in my opinion, if you want to actually scout them for a team. Solo queue is just one tool to use. But I think in China, what you did have really early on in their infrastructure, despite the fact that it wasn't very stable or like uniform across different organizations in terms of how players were being treated or how much they were being paid, if at all, etc. I do think you had a very young player base right off the bat. So you had a lot of players starting when they were like 12, 13, starting to play. And then like, for example, one of the most, if not the most famous player in China, Uzi I, was at Worlds when he was 16, and he was one of the few players that was grandfathered in after they made the rule that you had to be 17. I believe he'd been playing since there were servers in China, and he started at like an incredibly young age. And to Greg's point about like bringing up players and bringing them into an organization, I think a lot of Chinese teams also had to learn the same lessons where like, what kind of player do you want? And using Uzi as an example again, like he's actually come out in interviews and said like, I was a really bad teammate when I was younger because I didn't understand, how to be a teammate. I just understood how to play the game, like he understood the fact that he had really good mechanics, that he was incredibly talented, but he didn't really know how to get along with his teammates until later on in his career. So I think when I look at League of Legends in their early heyday, especially in China, where you just had this massive influx of like a giant player base, and trying to wade through that and trying to find people that you actually want for your team, it was really difficult at first. And I mean, solo rank was kind of the only thing initially that people used, either in China or how well they were playing on the Korean server, which was kind of the accepted like best server in the world.
I think that point, Emily, is really interesting because it's very different, I think, from a lot of traditional sports where because of the ease of being able to play, right, on alone in your house, right?
Yeah.
Like most esports, the way you sort of progress in the early days, right, is just that, like alone, playing in solo queue or the equivalent thereof, in other games. Versus a lot of traditional sports, like, it's kind of hard for you to play like an 11v11 game unless there's some sort of organized, element to it, for example, in soccer and other places. And so, I think that element of having to teach people how to play as a team is much bigger in esports than it is probably in other sports, where there's just already more, particularly in the West, I should say, infrastructure from an early age around teams and team play and sort of learning these more sort of macro, team concepts. And so I think that's definitely one of the things that's made talent development and identification, I think, more difficult in esports, particularly here, because, as you said, it's so different when you're looking at someone's rank on the ladder versus understanding who they are holistically, actually as a teammate, and as the game itself is just so different. And so I think that's a pretty big challenge that we have with esports relative to maybe some other traditional sports, and I certainly think that's particularly perhaps an issue here in North America where perhaps given player base, perhaps given some of the infrastructure and just historical reasons, we don't necessarily have some of the same structures in place that you see in Europe and you see in China and elsewhere from an earlier age.
I also think and one of the things that I guess I can praise Doug and his team for is that I've been really open about this as from the journalist side, that Scouting Grounds is like actually one of my absolute favorite events. And it's because you fly in a bunch of players who are doing really well in NA, like solo rank, and then you force them to be on the team together. And as someone who does embeds every year for that event, when you're sitting in a room and you're watching coaches coach these players, and these players kind of learn how do you get along with each other, and also just even basic stuff like how do I receive information, how do I give information to my teammates, and then coaches trying to mediate that because people always receive and take in information in different ways, right? So someone like, for example, me personally, I'm really direct, and that can come across as really bad if someone's very upset about their performance, So trying to mediate that and watching players overcome that and watching how different coaches use different styles to talk to these players and come up with teams. It's like one of the most fascinating events, I think, to kind of be a fly on the wall for. And it also, I assume the aim was to kind of create a bridge from solo rank to getting these guys into an environment where you can actually scout them in basically what is essentially a tryout, and then see how they get along with each other and work on a team in a team environment.
If I can add quickly, I think like a hidden element to this that's also super important is frankly actually coaching development in our ecosystem as well. I think we talk a lot about the players, but also like the level of sophistication of our understanding of League conceptually. I know I'm focusing on League of Legends, but also like how to relate to players and how to coach them and level them up. It's something we certainly actively think about, and to that point, we try to equip our coaches with as much information as possible. One of the soft data points that we use with our players is have them take certain personality tests to figure out what type of coaching methods will work best with individual players, how we might expect them to interact with each other. And I think the other part is just putting resource into developing out a staff, right? I think we have the base level understanding of coaching in NA so far is to have a head coach and maybe a strategic coach and academy coach. I think at EG, we're trying to build that out significantly, building out a whole staff with some more positional coaches, having our developmental staff and our coaches work together across our 3 teams and ultimately level up our understanding of the game and our players, not just from team to team, but as an organization holistically. And hopefully, our coaches move from this program and can help. Ideally they help us the most, but if they move on to other teams, that helps the whole ecosystem progress as well.
Yeah.
Greg, I think that's. No, sorry, Doug.
I was going to add, I think this is one of the areas where the future of data and analytics is honestly really going to help teams gain a competitive advantage. I mean, I think there's so much that we're going to see as, again, that development within the strategy and the player scouting and development of like the on the rift or on the field type elements. But then there's also the how do you optimize the ecosystem and the culture that surrounds a team in order to make the players ready to perform at the highest level? Because once we start getting at that prepping for the two best teams in the world to be able to compete, like it's going to be a game of inches really, and making sure we can find all those optimizations. So the teams that can develop the best ways of training, understanding what that optimization looks like, understanding what rest looks like in recovery time, and optimizing that entire journey leading up to that key matches is going to be pretty key for success in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And Greg, I'm really glad you brought up coaching, because I think often when we talk about analytics, particularly as it relates to esports, the focus is mostly on just like talent identification and scouting. But the reality is that, a significant amount of the value perhaps that can be unlocked is actually with development, and actually with like helping players get better and just like how you play the game, right? So if we think about a lot of the revolutions in traditional sports that came about from data, some of them are in terms of evaluating talent and roster construction, but a lot of them are just like, hey, there's actually a smarter way to play basketball, and it's take a lot of threes, right? And I suspect that we are really just scratching the surface of using data to figure out what are the better ways to play esports. I'm not saying that there's like perhaps a hidden gem quite the same way with threes in league. If I figure it out, Greg, I mean, I'm not competing against you anymore, so maybe I'll tell you, but I'll probably keep it to myself. But the reality is that I do think we're going to see folks get better at actually using data to train and to make decision-making about play styles, and sort of impact on the development side as well. And I think that's an underrated and under-considered part of sort of the analytics story in esports today.
I'm also glad that Greg brought up like fleshing out a coaching staff, because I also think it's really important. Like, I think even in traditional sports, I will bring up a Boston sports reference because that's where I'm from. If you look at, like, for example, the Bill Belichick coaching tree and how that worked out, you just had some people who were better as like analysts only. And I think one of the things that is still kind of being worked out in North America, but also across other regions, is the idea that if someone comes up and they're like a really good analyst, it does not necessarily mean that they're going to be a good coach. And maybe you need to find someone who is your coach, who is really good at like mediating conflict. And then you have an analyst, like, for example, on EG, you have Nasir, or Empire, I believe is still his handle, right? Who came from Clutch also, and is just like, honestly, in my opinion, one of the better analysts that LCS has. And I think it's really good that he hasn't been forced into like a head coaching position. I don't know if that's because he doesn't want it or whatever. I think he could do it, but I think it's very obvious that he is like incredibly analytically minded, incredibly smart, and being able to just do that role has obviously served him really well, because he's done incredibly well on multiple teams. And so I think if there's any like huge blind spot in terms of like how we look at coaching and how we look at analysts in League of Legends, it's that just because you're a good analyst does not necessarily mean you're going to be a good coach. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we often talk about on these esports panels here at Sloan is like what you can take from traditional sports, right? And I think, Emily, that nails it on the head. Like the coaching model, the building out the staff and having that coaching tree. I think those are precisely some concepts that we tried to pull in directly at EG. Like you mentioned, right? We're kind of, I know Cloud9 won the coaching team of the split, but I think we're pretty blessed at EG having, Peter Dunn be our head coach and working with all of our other coaching staff. We have support from with an analyst like Nasser. We have developmental support with a brilliant mind like Kelsey, and we've been able to bring all these like really excellent strategic minds together at EG to level up our players, level up the way all of them think about the game, and hopefully reap rewards for our org in the long term.
So we've talked a lot about League, right? But let's talk about Valorant for a second, or just use Valorant as a stand-in for kind of general new upcoming esports. So, Greg, y'all are involved in Valorant now. Tall, y'all were involved in Valorant at Immortals and have a lot of stuff. And obviously, Doug, you're extremely closely involved with data and Valorant. Curious on y'all's thoughts on kind of the differences between existing esports, let's say, that have built up ecosystems and newer esports, and how you're thinking about data, roster building, et cetera, as a holistic kind of model that's being built up.
Yeah. So, oh, sorry, Greg. Happy to.
I can jump in quickly. Yeah, I think like one of the great things or interesting things about Valorant, right, is that it's so new, right? The game's been out like not even a year, and like the esports ecosystem in NA and across the globe is budding. But from a team building perspective, and also like as an esports organization debating whether to enter the title and like have a presence in Valorant, it was an interesting exercise for us because, you know, the data isn't necessarily all available, right? We can see some stuff. We have a lot of good word of mouth about players, and the nature of competition right now, with it being open qualifiers and with it being like a broad open ecosystem and not having franchise leagues, teams can kind of go at their own pace and enter in the way that they think is best. For SCEG, like, you know, we've attacked that stems from our League of Legends pipeline, thinking about how to develop future champions and future stars and build teams in our mold with our ethos. And sort of from that, you know, we've gone sort of a different direction with our Valorant roster. I think we took a bit of a pioneering approach, being a tier 1 org, to roll out a mixed gender and roster in Valorant, because we believe like no one knows what the perfect Valorant team looks like. No one knows what franchising is going to look like. And given the fact that, you know, we have some time to be developmental and take a cut in open qualifiers to compete in our own way and bring a team up in our own way, we started with the base of having a captain and a really good pro to work with in Christine Potter Chi, and built out the rest of that roster through talent evaluation, trying to build in quantifiable like evidence where we could, but ultimately like doing a lot of scouting to come up with a roster that I think fits with us, not necessarily chasing championships, but having a team that we could bring up in our way and develop in our way and impart our own values and bring together culturally and really introduce to being that esports team, kind of like 3 steps before where we are in terms of like a League of Legends operation in terms of maturity. And, you know, it's been really exciting and kind of heartwarming to see that team like progress, because it's like their first esports experience in a new esport. And we're constantly learning and trying to think about how do we improve our coaching methods? How do we leverage data better if we can get our hands on more data there? And how do we think about coaching in a brand new sport, essentially?
Yeah, so you know, Ryan, I'm really glad you brought up Valorant for a whole host of reasons. One, because I think it's representative of certain esports that I think are on some level easier to think about using data than League, just given the nature and structure of the games, honestly. Because, you know, Valorant more round based, it sort of has more replicable moments in a way. Like the challenge, I think, with some respects, is that League is perhaps a little bit more like soccer, for lack of a better, you know, comparison or analogy, where it's a little harder to use data in some ways because it's not as, like, the moments are not as replicable in the same way. And Valorant, you know, in Counter-Strike, which is obviously, you know, sort of the OG FPS esports title, they are sort of on some level a little bit more similar to baseball, I think. From an analytics perspective, you can kind of have more sort of like replicable moments that you can then use data to understand performance. Not exactly, but more closely. So, you know, I'm particularly excited about data and its applications to games like Valorant. One of the things that we were interested in at Immortals when we were getting into the sort of the Valorant scene was, you know, a lot of folks were sort of just like picking up like CS rosters, basically Counter-Strike rosters, and porting people over, which makes sense because the games have, you know, similarity, and in a world where something's new and you have an absence of data, that can be an easier way to get going. Personally, I don't think that's going to be a long-term winning strategy, and I think already that's starting to really be the case. The games are different enough, and, you know, even historically, the way rosters were built in Counter-Strike, perhaps a little bit more by players than teams, maybe not as conducive to building the best teams in the world. And so we were really focused on running open trials and giving a shot to folks that were younger and sort of underdeveloped or overlooked. And that approach actually worked really well for us at Immortals. We were running our roster at a pretty significantly relative to some of the other teams. Like honestly, it's like a cheaper base, not because we weren't interested in investing into it, but we were able to put together really great teams with people that a lot of folks had never heard of, some of whom we then moved on from and then have gone to do great things on other teams as well. And I think it just speaks to the fact that because this industry is so nascent, there's a lot of people that are overlooked and a lot of younger talent that is underdeveloped and underinvested into. And I think that's true across a lot of esports. And so I think it's very cool, to see what Greg's doing at EG and to see a lot of folks using Valorant because it's new as an actual opportunity to focus more on younger, overlooked, underdeveloped talent as opposed to just sort of porting over or continuing to invest in the same names time and time again. So I'm excited to see how like that ecosystem continues to develop.
I think like a common thread that kind of came across this is that when a sport is this young, you need to be very open-minded, focus on learning and testing and iterating quickly in order to identify what's going to work, identify the right type of talent, and to lay that foundation for the infrastructure. From a Riot perspective, we've had a same type of mindset, but very different type of focus, and that we need to develop a sport. We need to make sure that the talent pipeline is going to come down. We need to develop a broadcast and a narrative that works, to define structure for the sport long term to support it. And so it has come to the development of the sport. Like our view is make sure the team brings as much experience into it as possible from league and from traditional sports, to sit very closely with the game team itself to understand how the game is going to be played out, what's going to be meaningful, and how best to highlight those components. And then to be ready to adapt extremely quickly. And so our views have been just to listen and to test. That's why we rolled out things like First Strike last year as a series, in order to get the community involved, to hear their thoughts, to understand what their needs were, to build that back into the game, and to have our engineers from an esports perspective sit right within the game team to then say, okay, the game needs X. Let's make sure that we're bringing that out. Let's build that into the broadcast. Let's bring it to the community. And let's continue to test and rapidly iterate. And I think that rapid iteration is something that's really interesting that we can do here, especially when developing a new esport. Like the differences in structure that you have from that versus the league allows us to move very fast. And over time, I think it helps us create a really great product and stand it up quickly and then build from there.
And yeah, I'm curious what Emily has to say on this one, because I remember like one of my favorite early pieces of esports coverage was how like some teams were starting to move away from Sage in early metas. I remember that article from Emily, but I think like one of the most exciting things about Val is like no one knows the best way to play, right? Tal alluded to, we have a lot of Counter-Strike players in the space, and I think in the early days, a lot of teams are getting by with just being able to aim and click heads, right? But
Yep.
I don't think we've seen like the beautiful game of Valorant incorporating all the different abilities and agents in like an optimal way. I think if I knew that, dug in my ranked games every night would probably be going a little better than they have recently. But I think it's exciting, right? And like how we can get data and incorporate data in terms of like, all right, if you combo like these agents with these abilities, like your ability to take a site is like goes up by X%. Like that's super exciting. I think like we've seen some coverage of that from a meta perspective, and I'm curious to see where we go, for sure.
So we have just about 10 minutes left here, guys. And so we should start moving to the Q&A section now. So start with the question for Emily. LCK and LEC players that have come to the LCS have obviously found great success, but there have been several flops as well from that pile. And there haven't been many LPL players that have come to the LCS. Do you think that NA teams could find success by bringing in some of the star LPL players as imports to the roster? And if so, what are some of the hiccups that people should be looking for?
So of course, I think that there are a ton of LPL. I mean, again, like China has the largest player base in the world, which just means statistically, if you're always taking like from the top, just even if the percentage is the same across all regions, the raw amount of players at the top in China is just going to be more people, right? So I don't think it's a matter of there aren't talented people in China that people want to bring over. There are a lot of like visa and banking issues that I'll put to the aside, but like I do want to mention, because I think bringing a player over from China has its own challenges that other regions don't have. And then on top of it, the thing that no one wants to talk about, but that I'm going to have to bring up is the fact that if you're going up against some of these larger Chinese organizations with a lot more capital, it's really difficult to contest. And I see Greg just nodding his head. It's a lot more difficult to contend with what these Chinese teams can give a player in their own region when they don't have to adapt to a completely different region. And then another layer that I do want to mention that I think some North American teams were a lot better than others, and it was pretty bad initially, to be honest, when we were looking at the first kind of wave of South Korean players that came over, is that teams were really unprepared to have these players. They didn't have, it's one thing to have a translator just for, I don't know, stage or interviews or scrims. It's another thing to actually have an interpreter, to have a staff that is ready to actually make that player feel like comfortable and overcome a lot of not just language, but cultural barriers. I'll bring up one time I embedded with the Immortals Overwatch team, so the LA Valiant, like a while ago, like 2018. And one of the things that really impressed me was that their interpreter was translating everything. And the reason why he did this, it was Andrew Kim. The reason why he did this is because he said it was so important, because naturally as a player, if like you're a South Korean player and you see two of your other North American players like joking around and laughing and you don't understand what they're saying, you might automatically assume and internalize, like, maybe I perform badly, maybe they're talking about me, when they're talking about like a TV show they watch together or something. And so like translating even that level of conversation was actually really important to having a roster that communicated really well, despite the fact that they had players from South Korea and players from North America. So I think bridging that gap is actually so important. And while we now have the infrastructure on a lot of teams that are used to bringing in South Korean players, you would have to do that now with a Mandarin speaker, right? Presumably, although there are a few players that come from like Cantonese speaking regions. I think that's actually why one of the few teams that has brought a player over is Team Solomid and Sword Art, because Peter Zhang is on that team. And so he has worked in China before. He's completely fluent in Mandarin. He, I believe, knew Sword Art previously anyway. And so Sword Art is also fluent in English, but like you have that bridge, you have someone to be able to bridge that gap between the team, right? And also, speaking of personality and scouting, Sword Art is the type of player who is very communicative anyway, like he's known for being a mood maker. He's known for being very communicative. He's not someone who is a little bit like, he's someone who's been around for a while. He's not someone who's super young and volatile and doesn't speak English and is just really nervous, right? And anxious, and you don't have to necessarily bridge that gap. So it's a combination of like scouting, having a good staff in place, all that kind of stuff. And I think maybe depending on the success of Sword Art, we'll see if people try to consider that more. But there are a few more barriers, in my opinion, to bringing over a player from the LPL.
Oh, yeah, from living in China for 5 years, I definitely feel a lot of those barriers. But it's a great answer. Last question here that we have time for is for Doug. Riot plays a large role in teaching viewers about analytics, right? With the on-air team broadcasting all sorts of statistics. So how do y'all at Riot decide which statistics are important for the broadcast?
That's a fun one. So when I started at Riot about 5 years ago, it was more of a normal practice for us to say, let's start on the air and see how it goes. And you kind of like trial by fire. And what we did back then was we actually sat back down and said, okay, let's reevaluate and put a process in place here. And we started with the questions, like what are like the burning questions that either our casters, our broadcast team, or others in the community are asking that we think we can answer with data. And then we essentially went through like a research and development pipeline process. Like we essentially identify the different methods that we can approach the problem with. We test those methods, we back test against the data, and we evaluate like, one, does this seem sound from a craft perspective? And then two, does it actually answer the question we're looking to do? And if we can pass those 2 bars, then what we can start to do is focus on the actual implementation. And that's been pretty key for us, is like maintaining a way of bringing that story to life and having it be consistent across 12 leagues, 3 international events. We want to make sure that a viewer that tunes in understands what that means, and that the context is the same if they're watching the LCK or if they're watching the LPL or the LCS. And so we've done work to build that out, to build that context, and then to take that information and try to unlock it within the community. So our team works really closely with the different thought leaders within the League of Legends space, and to get their feedback and to then iterate over that, so that their feedback and thoughts are being baked right in, because it's a constantly evolving thing, especially with a game that's consistently evolving every 2 weeks. And so that's the approach that we've taken, and I think it's given us some really interesting insights and ways of bringing the game to life. We're hoping to take similar practices as it comes to Valorant and other titles as well.
Cool. Well, this is all the time we have. So, thank you everyone for joining the panel. This was super interesting. I'm very excited to see where y'all take data and analytics, roster building, et cetera, in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ryan.
you.